Everyone, and welcome back to Contingent History. My guest today is Dr. Mark Goodacre. Mark is a professor of religious studies at Duke University, where he specializes in New Testament and Christian origins. He's the author of several books, including The Case Against Q, Thomas and the Gospels, and most recently, the Fourth Synoptic Gospel, which we'll be spending most of our time talking about today. So, Mark, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much, Tyler. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So maybe before we dive in to talk about the book, just give us a little bit of your personal journey to this point, your background, what got you interested in studying Christian origins.
Sure. Currently, as you mentioned, I'm teaching at Duke University. I've been here for 21 years, actually, which is crazy that it's gone by so fast. Before that, I taught at the University of Birmingham in the UK, which is not far from where I come from, which is in the East Midlands. And I was always absolutely fascinated, for as long as I can remember, with Christian origins. I already at school, already as a teenager, I was obsessed with the synoptic problem, which is probably quite unusual. But part of that comes from in the British public school system, like the state school system, which I was in. You do have to have religious education, and back in those days, in the 70s and 80s, religious education meant reading the Bible, and so I got really interested in reading the Bible, and especially noticing that there were really, really interesting similarities and differences. So yeah, that's the sort of origin of my interest in things. And when I went up to university in Oxford when I was 18, I did a degree in theology. And again, I got really, really interested in the Synoptic Gospels, John's Gospel, Paul. I was a very New Testament-y person, although I enjoyed the other theological topics as well. And I went on from there to do a master's in Master of Philosophy in New Testament, and also a Doctor of Philosophy in New Testament as well.
Great, yeah. I was over in Oxford earlier this spring presenting a paper. Actually, it's beautiful over there.
It is. Yeah, I love it over there. Yeah. I think there's something about walking the streets of Oxford and sitting in Oxford colleges and libraries that just make intellectual thoughts come more quickly. I found it really helpful for it somehow gets the thoughts flowing in ways that other places don't. So yeah, I love it over there.
Yeah, for sure. Great. So I feel like the thesis of your book is in some ways packed into the title. You're claiming there's a literary connection between the Gospel of John and the Synoptics, and I imagine there might be some varied responses to a position like that. Some people might think, well, of course, John has a literary connection, and others might feel very strongly the opposite way. And as far as I understand it, there has been a bit of an evolution of thought in the scholarly community about this. So Can you maybe begin by just giving us an overview of how that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, and I'm fully aware. Yeah, sure. Thanks. No, I'm fully aware that the title, "The Fourth Synoptic Gospel," is quite provocative. It's deliberately provocative. I do have plausible deniability on this because it's my publisher's title, not mine. But I acquiesced. They felt it would sell more copies with that title. But I don't balk at it. I don't back off it because I just make a very simple, straightforward point that John is technically a synoptic gospel in that you can frequently put John's passages alongside passages in the synoptics in a synopsis. Like a gospel synopsis is where you put Matthew, Mark, and Luke together side by side in columns for comparison, and you can add John to that. Not in every passage, but then you can't do it in every passage in Matthew, Mark, and Luke either. There's whole bunches of stuff that's only in Luke, loads of stuff that's only in Matthew, just as lots of stuff that's only in John. So it's really a technical point that John frequently is synoptic. You do have to then follow that up by saying, well, is it as synoptic as Luke is with respect to Mark and Matthew? No, of course it's not. There are degrees of difference. And Luke is much more similar to Mark and to Matthew than John is to any of those other three. Nevertheless, it is important to see that John is frequently synoptic, inspired by the synoptics, I argue, and aware of them and using them in a quite interesting way, I think.
Yeah, so one thing I found myself wondering about when I was reading the book and that I find myself wondering about, just thinking about Christian origins and the gospel texts in general, is the concept of book production in the ancient world, or what we might, call book production. How should we imagine that is happening? And I guess more importantly, how should we imagine other authors are coming in contact with one another's works? I imagine you obviously couldn't just go to a Barnes and Noble in ancient Rome and pick up a copy of a gospel. So do we have any idea how authors of the gospels might have been interacting with these texts?
Yeah, it's a really, really important question. And I think it's something that we've got better at answering as scholars in recent years. I mean, there are several people that have really pushed the study of book production, the use of ancient media forward. I'm loath to start listing names in case I miss out anybody important, but I've learned a lot from my colleagues and friends that have done investigations of these things. And the difficulty is, as soon as we say book, we do imagine, something, a bit like this, That's when you say book, that's what I'm thinking of. And it's pretty unlikely that any of the Gospels in their orthographs were written on as codices, ancient codices, like a book format. They were almost certainly written on rolls, like, scrolls. And so we need to sort of imagine that for starters. Think about them writing on scrolls. The question then about how did they publish the thing? Because if you've got no printing press, there's no sense of producing multiple copies all at once. So how was it published? And really, insofar as there was a publication process, it's all about networks of people, and that, someone somewhere hears about the existence of, let's say, Mark's Gospel, and they say, hey, this is great new book out, calls itself The Beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ. You've got to read it. It takes us all the way back to, like, John the Baptist and Galilee and stuff, before we even get to the crucifixion and resurrection. Dead interesting. Oh, I must have a look at this. Or, and then you try and find a copy, and the best way to get a copy in antiquity is send your scribe, quite often an enslaved worker, send your scribe to go and make a copy. Let's say, you've heard that there's a copy of this gospel knocking around in, some local community near to you. Let's say, I don't know, let's say you're somewhere in, let's say you're in Corinth, and and they've heard that, oh my goodness, this is, there's a copy of that new gospel here, and you send your scribe to go make a copy, and that's how these things get around. So sometimes it's a reputational thing that people must have heard. Oh, there's the new piece, and you get groups of elite literary artists as well, literary writers, that talk to one another, that engage with one another. I mean, Luke is even quite self-conscious about it. And at the very beginning of his gospel, he puts together this fine-sounding literary preface in which he talks about other works. Just as at the end of John's gospel, John talks about there being, about the plenty. If everything was written down that Jesus had done, then the whole world wouldn't fit all the books. So it's this self-conscious idea. This is just one among many. So So I mean, it's not an easy question to answer, but it's a fascinating and important question, and we have to use our imaginations to work out, how it was that the ancients produced their books. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, when thinking about the author of the Gospel of John maybe having that literary connection to the synoptic text, it really makes you kind of dive into that question, but also makes you wonder about the widespread availability of the synoptics by the time John was writing. I think if it proves plausible that John did have a literary connection to the synoptics, I think that speaks pretty strongly to the widespread availability of those texts by that time.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, one of the problems I think that we've had in scholarship is that we've been working with a model for quite a long time of, like, isolated communities. So every gospel comes from a particular community, and if you start thinking that gospel equals community, and a community is kind of walled, then you end up with a situation where it's difficult to imagine Luke knowing Matthew, John knowing Luke, etc. But I think if we push away from the idea of isolated communities and instead remember that people did talk to one another, and there were networks of not just authors, but different Christians. You read Paul's letters and people are traveling all over the place. When Paul writes the epistle to the Romans, you get to Romans 16 and he's greeting all these people. Paul hasn't been to Rome as far as we can tell, and yet he knows this bunch of people there. Well, how does he know all those people? It's because he's met them elsewhere. I mean, and some of them we've met in our travels as well, like Prisca and Aquila. Suddenly these people turn up. So if Paul's already able to assume all of that travel in the late 50s of the first century, it's very easy to imagine, like, the author of Mark's Gospel traveling with his Gospel, or people that had read it traveling with their copy, and so on. So I think, we have to get out of that kind of community, like the narrow community view, and remember that early Christians moved around in networks.
Sure, that is a good thing to remember, I think. I feel like this might be a good time to ask a kind of related question from one of my subscribers about authorship of the Gospels, actually. This is from a subscriber who goes by Sophia in the Shell. And their question is, how likely do you think it is that the traditional author attributions for the Gospels are correct? In other words, how likely is it that Luke the physician wrote Luke, Matthew the tax collector wrote Matthew, that kind of thing?
It's a great question, and it's one that I have been changing my mind about recently. I've always held to the position that the Gospels, the four canonical Gospels, are actually anonymous. In other words, they don't formally tell us anything about their authors or their authors' names. But I've begun to wonder about this. There's a very good article by my friend Simon Gathercole from 2018 which challenges the idea of the Gospels being anonymous. And there are a whole range of reasons why it's possible that these four Gospels were known from the beginning by these same names. One of them is that as soon as you've got more than one Gospel, what do you call the other ones? You've got Mark's Gospel. What do you say? So let's say people did call that the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, which is what the first verse of Mark is. Well, then you get Matthew's Gospel. What do you call it? That other Gospel that's a bit like Mark, that's a bit longer, that's a bit of a mouthful. Do you call it the Gospel book with the genealogy at the beginning? Well, that's a mouthful as well. Much easier to say Matthew's Gospel. And then you've got the question, apart from how you identify them, you've also got the question of, well, how plausible are those author attributions that we have? Now, I have much more sympathy with the idea that someone called Mark wrote Mark and someone called Luke wrote Luke than that someone called Matthew wrote Matthew and someone called John wrote John. The main reason being that Mark and Luke are such minor characters in the early Christian movement. I mean, the only reason that we think of them as major characters now is because we're so used to looking at the Gospels of Mark and Luke in the New Testament. But you read the rest of the New Testament, we're not even 100% sure who Mark is. I mean, there's someone that's mentioned in 1 Peter 5:13 that Peter calls my son Mark. Okay, so that looks like someone who might be thought of as the author of Mark's Gospel because he's got this link with Peter. And then we have someone called John Mark in Acts of the Apostles. We have a Mark that appears in Colossians as well. And then Luke, we have 3 mentions of outside of the Gospels. And again, he's like a really minor character. Yeah, he seems to be a physician according to Colossians 4. And he is someone that, is hanging around with Paul. But it's just not a major character. Not like, Silas or Barnabas or Apollos or these characters that actually have trajectories in Paul's letters. So the fact that they're so minor really gives me pause because, when you go to the 2nd and 3rd centuries, people are all the time attributing Gospels to the apostles. They're attributing them to Peter, to Philip, even to Judas Iscariot, to Mary. You've got all of these apostolic names of major characters. And then you've got Mark and Luke. I mean, it's fascinating. And the point of all this, I suppose, is if you were doing it pseudepigraphically, if you weren't Mark or you're not Luke, do you attribute your gospel to a really minor character? Maybe you do. Maybe because it gives you a plausible deniability. But gosh, it's a risky move. If you're not Mark or Luke, it's risky calling your Gospels that, because people might say, "Well, who's that? I don't know. I'm going to slightly leave that question open because I think it's at the moment it's one of the questions that really, really fascinates me, and I think I've left behind the dogma that says the Gospels are all anonymous and all four of those names are inferred by the earliest Christians. It may be that that's the case, but I'm not going to state that dogmatically.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think it's totally acceptable to leave that open. I mean, it's a pretty complex question to answer, I think, but I hadn't actually thought about the minor nature of some of those attributions, Mark and Luke before. That is an interesting point.
I think that's slightly more. I mean, I mentioned Simon Gathercole's article. I think that's a little bit. I mean, he does kind of hint at that, but that's not his major point. I think it's more something that I don't want to kind of misattribute it. I think that's more something I'm bringing to the table as something that concerns me. It is different with Matthew and John because John's Gospel, I think, is making a tacit claim that its author is connected with someone called John. And I think it's someone called John who's one of the 12. And my sense is that that's probably not historical. At least it's not historical in the sense that John, son of Zebedee, is penning this gospel. I think it's somebody else that is writing this gospel, and they're suggesting that it's got this foundation around this ideal disciple of Jesus. Matthew's curious because we don't know a great deal about Matthew, the disciple of Jesus. And even Matthew's gospel doesn't tell us anything fresh about him at all. I mean, the only new thing is that he takes the story of the calling of Levi, son of Alphaeus, from Mark's gospel and switches that to someone called Matthew. That's the one contribution that we have. Otherwise, there's nothing new.
Yeah, I mean, that's another thing that I guess complicates the discussion a little bit. The names of the disciples are not identical in all of our texts. So, yeah, it just makes it more fun to try to get to the bottom of, I suppose. But all right, so let's maybe shift then to getting a little deeper into the book then. As you've mentioned before, you're not really arguing that John is synoptic in the exact same way that maybe the synoptics are with one another. But the same general story is there in John as we find in the synoptics, albeit with some variations in narrative order and different ways that Jesus is presented, that sort of thing. But can you maybe walk us through a few of the prominent examples that best kind of encapsulate the idea that John is synoptic in some way?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the thing that I suppose when I was writing the book really began to stick out was the example of the anointing in John chapter 12. Now, I've thought about the anointing a lot over the years because Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have stories of Jesus getting anointed by an anonymous woman. And the thing that's so striking about John's version is it's far more similar to Matthew's and Mark's version than Luke's is to Mark's and Matthew's version. In other words, John in chapter 12 is more synoptic than Luke. There are some parallels between John, Luke, Matthew, Mark in that story, and there are some parallels unique to John and Luke there. But the majority parallels are Matthew, Mark, and John. That's really, really striking. I mean, and one of the things that I noticed when I started doing the reading about John's Gospel, I noticed that people tend to talk about elements in the story and traditions. Like for example, the woman comes in to anoint Jesus, and people say, "Good grief! That pistic nard that could have been sold for 300 denarii." It has that in both Mark and John. So people go, 300 denarii. That's an element where the link. Now that is interesting, that link. But what is more interesting is that the structure of the story is the same. If you put them side by side, the Markan and the Lucan, if you put them by side, the Markan and the Johannine, so Matthew, Mark, John, put those side by side, the structure is exactly the same. The things that are a little different are elements like, instead of being anonymous in John, she's now called Mary. Instead of the criticism about the costliness of the perfume being coming from anonymous bystanders. It's now Judas Iscariot. But outside of those things, the structure is basically the same. And I just found that really overwhelming that when you get your synopsis of the Gospels out, John is just so close to Matthew and Mark. And it's not a unique example. You can then start pulling out other examples. One of the ones I love using in my teaching is the story of the arrest of Jesus. So it comes in all four Gospels at the same point. And in all four canonical Gospels, there are key points that are identical. So take the chopping off of the high priest's slave's ear. That comes in all four canonical Gospels. But then uniquely in John, you get the name of the person who did it, and it's Peter. And you get the name whose ear is cut off, and it's Malchus. But then in just Luke and John, it's said to be his right ear. In just Luke, the ear is healed. In Matthew and John, Jesus says, put your sword away, put it back in its sheath. And so you can keep sort of looking at these sort of parallels. Matthew, John, Luke, John, John, all three, and so on. Really just explicitly synoptic. So there's no question that John is synoptic in those areas, because if it wasn't, we wouldn't be able to compare in the way that we are doing at the moment.
Yeah, fascinating. And I remember reading in your book, too, in kind of a related note, there are points in John where it seems like the author is kind of presupposing their audience's knowledge of either stories or events that happened in the synoptics. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I was really pleased with that chapter, actually.
Yeah, it was good.
Thank you. The thesis of that chapter is that John frequently presupposes narrative elements from the synoptics that he doesn't himself narrate. Like, he doesn't ever get around to narrating John's arrest, but he presupposes knowledge of it because he says, well, this happened before John got arrested, he says in 3:24.
This is John the Baptizer, right?
Yeah, sorry, John the Baptizer, apologies. Yeah. So it gets confusing when we talk about John's Gospel and John the Baptizer. But yeah, so John the Baptist gets arrested. And his arrest is actually narrated in the Synoptics, but not in John. Or when we get to meet Lazarus in John chapter 11, John, the author, the Gospel of John says that Lazarus is this certain man. The audience has apparently never heard of him before. So he says, a certain man, Lazarus, he lived in Bethany, which was the village of Mary and Martha. And the curious thing about that is he doesn't say the town of certain women called Mary and Martha. He presupposes we know who Mary and Martha are. Now, what's going on there is that there are two sisters called Mary and Martha that crop up in Luke 10:38-42. So it turns out that John presupposes the reader's knowledge of these two characters, which is really pretty striking. And then I list another. I have 10 examples altogether. I like top 10s, so I did 10 examples. I had to put... There's plenty more, but I thought let's focus on the 10 best examples. Now, it's not unique to me, this argument isn't. I first read about it in a scholar called Richard Borkham, who wrote an article about how John expects his readers to know Mark's Gospel. But after reading that, I realised that Borkham had been preempted by several other scholars, including Margaret Davis, who made this argument before Borkham did. And then when I started digging around in late 19th, early 20th century materials, I found that people did use similar arguments quite a bit, that John is presupposing narrative elements from the synoptics. So I pulled in all of their best examples and added some of my own to that. It's always kind of encouraging when if you have what you think's a new idea and then you find out that somebody else has actually argued the case in the past, it's kind of encouraging because it prevents you from thinking maybe I'm crazy, because it's always a difficult and weird position to be in, to be saying no one's ever noticed this before, because how could people have not noticed it before, when they've been looking at the tiniest details in John's Gospel for years and years and years. So I was actually quite pleased with that chapter. It's funny, even though it was one of the earliest chapters I planned, it's one of the last chapters I actually wrote. The writing process is a strange thing, but I think it's the last one I wrote complete, from... I mean, the problem is writing process is weird. I mean, people write differently, but I didn't start with chapter 1 and write all the way to chapter 7. I bobbed around all the time. So I think chapter 4 I wrote last. That's the one on presupposition. I think so. Yeah, I think that was I wrote a whole chunk of chapter 7, the Christology chapter, right at the end, because I suddenly made a fresh discovery really late on in the writing process, which meant I had to rewrite a whole bunch of that stuff. That's always fun too. It's annoying because it delays your delivering the manuscript to the publisher, but it's encouraging because you think, "Ooh, I'm still thinking fresh thoughts,"
Right. Yeah. So you mentioned Christology. How does the Johannine Christology kind of play into your position here that John is synoptic? Is it does it lend itself to that position, or is that one of the things that kind of like complicates the idea a little bit?
Well, you'd have thought that it's one of the areas where John is least synoptic, is Christology, because what's famous about John is things like the prologue, where he has this amazing poem about the Logos, the Word, and the Word becoming flesh in John 1:14. And there's no sign of that kind of Logos, Word Christology in the Synoptics. And so straight from the get-go, John chapter 1, oh my goodness, this is not a Synoptic Gospel, is what you're kind of thinking. And then probably the second most or equal most famous thing about John's Gospel is that Jesus keeps saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine, I am the good shepherd, I am the light of the world, and so on. And you don't have any of those statements in the synoptics. So you might think that John really distinguishes itself from the others when it comes to Christology, and in many senses it does. But what I want to argue is that the Christology of John is actually grounded in synoptic Christology. So even to take those I am sayings, every single one of them uses imagery that's familiar to us from the Synoptic Gospels. So, you take the light of the world, to phos tu cosmou in Greek, and you get that in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 5, where he says to the disciples, you are the light of the world. Or you take the image of the Good Shepherd, I am the Good Shepherd. Well, is Jesus ever a good shepherd in the synoptics? Yeah, of course he is. I mean, we've got the parable of the lost sheep, which is literally about Jesus being the good shepherd that takes care of every single one of the sheep. Or you have the verse, strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered, as part of the Passion narrative. So yeah, you have those really, really close matchups, really, between John and the synoptics. And the other thing that I found just really, really striking is that when the author of the Fourth Gospel wants to home in on the most important element of Christology, the number one thing, what's the number one thing he wants to home in on? You go to 20, 30, and 31. He says there are many other signs which we could write about, but these ones are written in order that you may know that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing in him, you might have life in his name. So what John thinks is most important is Messiah and Son of God. You couldn't want for more synoptic Christology than that. In Matthew 16, when Peter is asked, who do you say that I am? He says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. So when you get to the conclusion of John, when he states his reason for writing, his Christological reason for writing, the Christological reason for writing is that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. It's really pretty striking. So that's really what I argue in that last chapter, that yes, John's Christology is distinctive and it has its own special elements, but that doesn't mean it's not grounded in a very similar Christology to what you find in the Synoptics.
Yeah, fascinating. So I'm still kind of working my way through, like in this moment, some of the differences in John, and kind of wondering what the maybe purpose behind those was. One of the things that I keep coming back to is the disruption of the temple that happens pretty early in the story in John, but happens near the end of the synoptic stories. Is that a situation where you feel like the author of John is still, yes, familiar with that story because they have a literary connection with the synoptics, but they're, for maybe theological reasons or just narrative reasons, choosing to locate that somewhere else in their story?
Yeah, I mean, It's one of the most striking differences between the Synoptics and John, that the cleansing of the temple comes so early in John in chapter 2 and not at the end as it does in the Synoptics. But that fact belies these really striking similarities. I mean, the story in John still happens at Passover. It's just it's Passover at the beginning of his ministry, not Passover at the end. So he retains the key dating of the event. And you also get a strong connection with Jesus' passion there, because you get this line, "Zeal for your house has consumed me." And the disciples actually only fully understand the meaning of the cleansing of the temple after the resurrection. This is what the narrator says. They didn't get it at the time, but they understood it after the resurrection. So even though that story is right at the beginning of John, the author of the Fourth Gospel is still getting the reader to think about the Passion. Probably the reason why he wanted to bring it forward. And actually, it's not dissimilar again to Mark's Gospel, because Mark's Gospel from chapter 2, verse 1 to 3, verse 6 has this series of controversy stories where Jesus just keeps getting to loggerheads with the authorities. And in John's Gospel, basically, it's that same conflict begins right at the beginning. It's just that usually in John's Gospel, he makes the opponents that conflict Judean authorities, and that seems to be the focus of it in John. You get some of that in Mark's Gospel, especially, of course, in the Passion narrative, but Mark also includes other antagonists that are kind of major in the Galilean bit of the ministry. Anyway, yeah, I mean, so even where, I mean, I find this at point after point, even where John is most distinctive, you still keep seeing his links with the Synoptics, which would be really striking if he wasn't in some sense inspired by them and working, with knowledge of them.
Yeah, for sure. I think another element that kind of came to mind as I was both reading your book and kind of preparing to talk to you here today was the concept of oral tradition. I'm sure this is something that other people have maybe brought up to you in conversations about this, but we're pretty confident that there were a lot of stories being told about Jesus from the time of his death until the Gospels were first written down, and it's pretty likely that those stories varied depending on geographic location and the communities that were circulating them. And I think we have evidence that there's kind of evolving traditions happening as well. What role do those evolving traditions or something like oral tradition play in this discussion? Are we better served to say that there is a literary connection between John and the Synoptics, or that the similarities that we find there are better described by oral tradition?
Yeah, I mean, I do have some problems with the way that scholars appeal to oral tradition. And I think the way that I could probably crystallize it is to say that my problem with the appeal to oral tradition isn't about what it affirms, but about what it denies. So what it's affirming is exactly what you're saying, which is people told each other stories about Jesus. Surely they did. It's kind of obvious, really. The problem with the appeal to oral tradition is what it denies, which is that there are literary links between John and the Synoptics. And so many scholars, for some reason, they prefer the appeal to lost oral traditions to the appeal to literary links. So what I'm trying to do is say, you can see literary links, like things that only make sense if you're looking at parallel literary structures, for example, or very precise kind of wording and phrases. Those are the things that show that you've got, kind of two literary authors knowing one another, or at least one knowing the other's work. The appeal to oral tradition, it comes in for lots of New Testament scholars just because they feel anxious about literary knowledge one of another, and it's a really curious thing. There's a whole bunch of things at work here. I think one of them is that the appeal to oral tradition really allows scholars to say what they want. So you can say at any point, oh, well, this must have come to John from the oral tradition. And I can't refute that because I haven't got the oral tradition. I haven't got the biblical time machine to go and interview the people and talk to them. I haven't got any recordings because they didn't have any recordings then. So it's completely non-deniable, and sometimes statements that are impossible to verify or impossible to refute. There's something a little there's something suspicious about them. And like I say again, it's not that there wasn't oral tradition and that early Christians didn't work with oral tradition, but it's that scholars, when they appeal to it, frequently appeal to it to get themselves out of trouble. You know, there's the function it plays, I think, in scholarship that I have the problem with, if that makes sense. I can't help pointing out in the book as well that some ancients were suspicious of oral tradition as well. So there's a story in John 21 in which the author seems to be correcting a false oral tradition. There's this tradition that the beloved disciple will never die, and the author goes to great lengths to try and correct this false tradition. So you know, the ancients actually kind of like written stuff. We always think, you know, there's this great cliche of it was a really oral culture. Everyone was oral. Everyone, you know, so many people were illiterate. Yeah, but the people that wrote the Gospels weren't illiterate. They were highly literate people, you know. So, I mean, yes, of course, there was, you know, orality was huge in the 1st and 2nd centuries, but that doesn't mean that you have to make it the sole explanatory factor, especially when you're using it as a means of denying, to me, what's plain, which is that there are literary links.
Yeah, I think that's a fair angle to take on it for sure. And you know, I highly recommend that everybody read this book in hard copy, in particular, because there's one of the things I really appreciated about it was the way that you kind of structured all of your arguments with all of these textual examples and like side-by-side comparisons. I thought that was very helpful, and would, I'm sure, be helpful to my listeners as well.
Thanks.
Well, before we wrap up, Mark, let me just ask, what is kind of on the horizon for you? Is there anything new that you're working on? Any new book projects that we should be expecting in the near future?
Book projects, yeah. I'm working on a new edition of the Gospel of Thomas with a fresh translation and textual commentary and so on. It's part of a series called CGAT, Coptic Gospels and Associated Texts, which is edited by Francis Watson, Kimberly Fowler, and Sarah Parkhouse. Love working on that with a team of other scholars. And I'm writing at the moment a piece which could easily have been chapter 8 of my book, which is all about John, Jesus, and History. The paper is called When John is Synoptic, How Historical is Jesus? Because a lot of people have asked me about the book. Well, okay, so let's say John is using the Synoptic Gospels. What does that tell us about the historical Jesus? And I was going to make that a chapter in the book, but I thought, I'll be absolutely honest, it was just too difficult to write. And I kept shooting at it and failing. But since finishing the manuscript, I've worked out how to tackle it. So I'm writing that as a standalone paper, and maybe if I ever get a second edition of the book, maybe I'll throw that paper in. But anyway, there's that. In the longer term, I want to write a book on Messianism and Christology. I've been wanting to do that for about 20 years. But other things keep popping up. So I'm going to really prioritize my book on Messianism and Christology next, after I've finished on Thomas.
Very good. That all sounds real exciting. We'll be sure to keep an eye out for it. Well, thanks again for being here, Mark, and having a awesome discussion about the Fourth Synoptic Gospel.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you, Tyler.